The millionaire arrived with his maid at his ex-fiancée's wedding, but her words in the middle of the party left everyone speechless. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The air was thick with the quiet hum of a distant vacuum cleaner and the faint scent of furniture polish. Martha adjusted her apron, her hands steady yet purposeful, as she meticulously rearranged the porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece of the sprawling Bennett estate. Each piece was a delicate reminder of the world James Bennett inhabited, one of opulence, power, and the expectations of high society. For over 2 decades, Martha had served as the housekeeper of this grand home, tucked in the heart of Boston's elite Beacon Hill neighborhood. The mansion exuded wealth, with its towering ceilings, glistening chandeliers, and walls adorned with oil portraits of James's ancestors. Yet for all its grandeur, the home felt colder than ever, its emptiness a stark reflection of the man who owned it. James Bennett was not a man to dwell on emotions. At 48, his demeanor was polished, his reputation impeccable, yet there was a quiet loneliness about him that few dared to acknowledge. Martha had long since learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, understanding his silence better than most. It was in those silences that she had come to admire him, not as her employer, but as a man of deep integrity, burdened by memories he rarely spoke of. As Martha dusted the edge of an antique desk, her hand paused over a photograph, partially hidden under a pile of correspondence. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she recognized the smiling faces of a younger James and a radiant woman in a white dress, Caroline. The memory hit her like a wave. Caroline Prescott, the socialite who had once been the center of James's world. Martha remembered the days leading up to their ill-fated engagement. The house had been alive with anticipation, the staff bustling to prepare for the wedding that never happened. But what lingered most vividly in Martha's mind was the truth she had witnessed, and the secret she had carried in silence ever since. Lost in thought, Martha barely noticed the sound of approaching footsteps until James's voice broke through her reverie. "Martha," he said, his tone as calm and measured as always. "Is everything all right?" She turned quickly, smoothing her apron as she held up the photograph. "I found this on your desk. Mr. Bennett," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, his expression softened, the weight of the past flickering in his gaze. He took the photo from her hands, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "I thought I'd gotten rid of all of these," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Then, looking at Martha, he added, "Strange how things have a way of resurfacing." Martha nodded, her heart heavy with unspoken words. She knew better than to pry, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the man who had been so profoundly hurt by the woman in the photograph. Later that evening, as she set the table for James's solitary dinner, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the empty halls. She opened the door to find a delivery man holding a sleek black envelope embossed with gold. The invitation inside was addressed to James Bennett, an invitation to Caroline's wedding. The irony was not lost on Martha as she handed the envelope to James, who stood in the doorway of his study. He read the invitation in silence, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. After a long pause, he folded it neatly and placed it on his desk. "Another Prescott spectacle," he said, his tone light but his expression unreadable. "Let's see how well she performs this time." Martha didn't respond. She knew better than anyone that James's sarcasm was his armor. But as she watched him retreat into his study, she felt the familiar ache of wanting to protect him from a world that seemed determined to test his resilience. That night, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her modest room in the attic, Martha allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had spent years in the shadows of this house, watching over James, ensuring his life ran smoothly while keeping her own feelings hidden. But the arrival of that invitation felt like the prelude to something larger, a shift she couldn't quite define, but knew she would be powerless to avoid. The past had returned to haunt them both, and Martha had the sinking feeling that her role in James's life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. The next morning arrived with a crisp clarity that belied the tension lingering in the Bennet household. The golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting an almost too perfect glow over the immaculate furnishings. Martha moved quietly through the house, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpets as she began her daily routine. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her thoughts kept returning to the black envelope resting on James's desk. By mid-morning, James entered the kitchen, where Martha was arranging fresh flowers in a vase. His tailored suit and confident posture gave him the appearance of a man in full control, but Martha, with her practiced eye, noticed the slight furrow in his brow and the tension in his shoulders. "Good morning, Martha," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of something unresolved was unmistakable. "Good morning, Mr. Bennet," she replied, glancing at him briefly before returning to her flowers. He stood silently for a moment, sipping his coffee as if considering his next words. Finally, he placed the cup on the counter and turned to face her fully. "The Prescott wedding," he began, his tone measured. "I've decided to attend." Martha paused, her hands stilling over the vase. She had expected as much, but hearing him say it aloud made the reality sink in. "I see," she said carefully, not wanting to reveal the mixture of concern and curiosity stirring within her. James took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I need you to come with me." The words hung in the air, as startling as they were unexpected. Martha blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Me?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, you," he replied simply, as though the matter were already settled. "I trust you, Martha, more than anyone. And if I'm going to face that circus, I need someone I can count on." Martha's mind raced. She couldn't fathom why he would choose her for such an occasion, let alone imagine herself stepping into a world so far removed from her own. "But, Mr. Bennet," she began hesitantly, I mean, that's not my place." James interrupted her gently but firmly. "You've been by my side through everything, Martha. You've seen more of my life than most people ever will. If there's anyone who belongs at that wedding with me, it's you." Martha felt a warmth rise to her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and an unfamiliar sense of pride. Yet the practical part of her couldn't ignore the implications. "But what would people think?" she asked, voicing the question that loomed largest in her mind. James gave a faint, almost defiant smile. "Let them think what they want. I've spent enough of my life worrying about appearances. You're more than a housekeeper, Martha. You're my friend, and I need you there." His words struck a chord deep within her. For years, she had dedicated herself to his household, maintaining a quiet, steadfast presence in his life. To hear him acknowledge her as more than just an employee was both validating and unsettling. I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, as though he had expected her hesitation. "Take your time," he said, his tone kind but resolute. "But the wedding is in 2 weeks, and I'd like you to be there." As he left the kitchen, Martha sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of his request settled over her like a heavy cloak. Attending that wedding would mean stepping out of her carefully constructed world and into a realm of scrutiny, judgment, and memories she had worked hard to bury. For the rest of the day, she found it nearly impossible to concentrate. As she polished silverware and dusted bookshelves, Her mind replayed James's words over and over. What would it mean to stand by his side at such a moment? What would it reveal about her own feelings, the ones she had kept hidden for so long? That evening, as she prepared to retire, she found herself lingering outside James's study. The soft glow of the desk lamp spilled through the cracked door, and she could hear the faint rustle of papers. She considered knocking, but instead, she stepped away, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. In her attic room, Martha sat by the window, staring out at the city lights that twinkled in the distance. Somewhere out there, Caroline Prescott was preparing for her lavish wedding, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the life of the man she had left behind. And here Martha was, caught in the middle of it all, unsure of where she belonged, or where this unexpected invitation might lead her. The morning light streamed through the narrow window of Martha's attic room, casting soft golden hues on the modest furnishings. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by James's request and the world it would thrust her into. The delicate balance she had maintained for years seemed suddenly precarious. Martha busied herself with the routine tasks of the household, trying to shake off the unease. She swept the hardwood floors, dusted the antique armoires, and tended to the fresh linens in the guest rooms. Yet no matter how much she immersed herself in her work, the question lingered, could she truly accompany James to the Prescott wedding? As she arranged a bouquet of hydrangeas for the dining room table, Margaret Bennet strode into the room with her usual briskness. Margaret, James's sister, was a woman of sharp wit and even sharper intuition. Though her visits were infrequent, they always brought a lively energy to the otherwise subdued mansion. "Martha," Margaret said, her voice warm but inquisitive, "I hear my brother has an interesting proposition for you." Martha froze, her hands tightening around the vase. She forced a smile and turned to face Margaret. "I wasn't expecting you today, Miss Bennet." Margaret waved dismissively, her auburn curls bouncing as she laughed. "Oh, don't change the subject. James told me he wants you to go to the Prescott wedding with him. Quite the scandalous choice, if you ask me." Her tone was teasing, but her sharp eyes studied Martha closely. Martha felt her cheeks flush. "I don't think it's a good idea, Miss Bennet," she said cautiously. "It's not my place to attend events like that." "Nonsense," Margaret replied, taking a seat at the table and gesturing for Martha to join her. "You've been more of a constant in James's life than anyone else. If he wants you there, it's because he trusts you." Martha hesitated before sitting down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But what will people think?" she asked quietly. "I'm just a housekeeper. I don't belong in that world." Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening. "Martha, do you honestly think James cares what people think? That's never been his style. He's choosing you because you've been there for him through everything. And if you ask me, you belong at his side far more than anyone else in that crowd." Martha wanted to believe Margaret's words, but the prospect still felt overwhelming. She had spent her life in the background, ensuring others shone while she remained invisible. To step into the spotlight, even for James, felt like a betrayal of her carefully constructed anonymity. Later that afternoon, as she polished the silver in the dining room, James entered, his expression unreadable. He approached her slowly, his hands in his pockets, and waited until she looked up. "I know you're hesitating," he said softly, "and I understand why. But Martha, this isn't about them. It's about us. I don't want to go to that wedding alone, and I can't think of anyone else I'd rather have with me." His words were sincere, devoid of the polished detachment he often used with others. For a moment, Martha saw the vulnerability he so rarely showed, and it tugged at something deep within her. "Why me, Mr. Bennet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James met her gaze, his eyes steady. Because you're the only person who's always been honest with me. You've seen me at my worst and never judged me for it. That kind of loyalty is rare, Martha. I don't take it for granted. Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to protest, to remind him that her loyalty stemmed from her position, not from anything extraordinary about herself. But the way he looked at her, as though she was more than just his housekeeper, left her momentarily speechless. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. James nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Take your time," he said, "but don't let fear make the decision for you." As he left the room, Martha leaned against the table, her hands gripping the edge for support. His words had planted a seed of courage, but the shadows of doubt still loomed large. Could she truly step into a world so foreign, knowing the scrutiny she would face? That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Martha replayed the day's conversations in her mind. Margaret's encouragement, James's vulnerability, and her own fears swirled together in a tumult of emotions. The decision before her felt like a crossroads, one that could alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain. Her choice would not only shape her future, but also redefine her place in James's world. The following morning dawned with a grey sky, the kind that seemed to mirror Martha's swirling thoughts. The usual rhythm of her day felt heavier, her movements slower, as if burdened by the weight of her indecision. Each chore brought her back to the same question. Should she go to the wedding with James, or remain in the safety of her quiet, predictable life? As she folded linens in the laundry room, a knock at the door startled her. It was Margaret, holding a steaming cup of tea and wearing a knowing smile. "Thought you might need this," she said, placing the cup on the nearby table. Martha smiled weakly, grateful for the gesture. "Thank you, Miss Bennet." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Martha, please, it's just Margaret. Now, how are you holding up with all this wedding nonsense?" Martha hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm not sure what to do," she admitted. "It feels too much." Margaret sat down on a nearby chair, her expression softening. "I get it. Walking into that world isn't easy. Trust me, I grew up in it, and I still don't feel like I belong half the time." Martha looked up, surprised. "But you're James's sister. Surely you've always been part of it." Margaret laughed, a dry, self-deprecating chuckle. "Oh, Martha, the Prescotts and their ilk are another breed entirely. They thrive on appearances and power plays. James learned that the hard way with Caroline, but you're different, and that's exactly why he needs you there." Martha absorbed Margaret's words, her heart tugging in conflicting directions. "But what if I embarrass him? What if I don't measure up?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "You've been by his side for over 20 years, Martha. If anyone measures up, it's you. And if those snobs can't see that, it's their loss." The conversation stayed with Martha as she moved through the day. Later, as she dusted the library shelves, she found herself drawn to a familiar book, a collection of essays on integrity and resilience that James often read. She ran her fingers over the worn spine, remembering the late nights when she'd catch him poring over its pages, seeking solace in its wisdom. By evening, James approached her again, this time in the sitting room. He carried an old photograph in his hand, one she recognized immediately. It was of his parents, a rare image of them smiling together. "They always told me to focus on what truly matters," he said, his voice low, "to surround myself with people who make me better." "Martha, you've done that for me more times than I can count." She felt her throat tighten at his words, her carefully built defenses wavering. "But what about what matters to me?" she asked, surprising even herself with the question. James looked at her, his expression earnest. "Then tell me, what does matter to you, Martha? Because if it's something I can give, I will." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. For years, she had buried her own desires beneath layers of duty and practicality, but in that moment, she allowed herself a flicker of vulnerability. "I want to feel like I belong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then let me show you that you do, not because of what you do, but because of who you are." Martha's heart raced as she processed his words. They carried a truth she wasn't ready to face, yet couldn't ignore. She nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered. "Think about it," he said gently, "but don't let fear decide for you." As he left the room, Martha sat alone in the fading light, the photograph still in her hand. She stared at the smiling faces of James's parents, feeling their words resonate through him and into her own life. The evening stretched into night, and as she lay in bed, Martha replayed the day's events. Margaret's encouragement, James's unwavering support, and her own inner turmoil swirled together in her mind. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This decision was about more than a wedding. It was about taking a step into the unknown, and perhaps, for the first time, truly embracing her own worth. The morning broke clear and quiet, the sunlight spilling through the windows of the Bennett estate and painting the walls in soft gold. Martha stood by the kitchen counter, her hands busy kneading dough for the day's bread, though her mind was far from the task. For days, James's words and Margaret's encouragement had echoed in her thoughts, weaving a thread of doubt and possibility that she couldn't untangle. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as James entered the kitchen. He was dressed casually, a departure from his usual polished suits, and his expression was lighter than it had been in days. "Martha," he began, his voice calm but deliberate, "I won't press you further about the wedding, but I do hope you know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it." She looked up, meeting his gaze. His sincerity was unmistakable, and for a moment she saw not the polished businessman, but the man who had once entrusted her with his home, his life, and his quiet struggles. "I appreciate that, Mr. Bennett," she replied softly, returning her focus to the dough. "But I haven't decided yet." James nodded, understanding but not pressing further. He poured himself a cup of coffee and lingered at the counter for a moment before stepping away, leaving her with her thoughts. Later that day, as Martha walked through the gardens, trimming the overgrown lavender bushes, Margaret joined her. With a pair of gardening gloves in hand, she knelt beside Martha and began pulling weeds, her movements deliberate but unhurried. "You know," Margaret began, breaking the silence, "it's not about the wedding itself. It's about what it represents." Martha paused, her shears poised over a stem. "What do you mean?" Margaret turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just about accompanying James. It's about showing yourself that you can step into that world and hold your head high, that you deserve to be there just as much as anyone else." Martha's chest tightened at the words, their truth cutting through her defenses. She had always defined herself by her role in James's household, never daring to consider what she might deserve beyond it. That evening, as she prepared to retire, a knock at her door startled her. Opening it, she found Margaret holding a garment bag and a small box. "What's this?" Martha asked, her brows furrowing. "A little nudge," Margaret replied with a grin. "Open it." Martha unzipped the bag to reveal an elegant but understated dress in a soft shade of navy, perfectly tailored yet modest enough to suit her taste. The box contained a pair of simple pearl earrings. Martha's breath caught as she ran her fingers over the fabric. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice trembling. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not just accepting a dress, Martha. You're accepting the possibility of something more. Trust me, you'll look stunning, and James won't know what hit him." Martha managed a weak laugh, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She hugged the garment bag to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture, but also by the realization that this was no longer just about James's request. It was about taking a chance on herself. As the night deepened, Martha stood before her small attic mirror, holding the dress against her frame. She imagined herself at the wedding, not as a housekeeper, but as an equal beside James. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, she allowed herself a quiet smile. The decision wasn't yet fully formed in her mind, but the smallest part of her was beginning to lean toward courage. And for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of anticipation for what lay ahead. The morning was alive with a crisp vibrancy, the kind that hinted at the changing seasons. Martha stood at the large bay window in the kitchen, gazing out at the sprawling garden. The dress Margaret had given her hung neatly in her wardrobe upstairs, a silent yet persistent reminder of the decision she needed to make. She felt the weight of it, though today her resolve seemed a little firmer. James appeared in the doorway, his steps deliberate and his gaze steady. He carried an envelope in his hand, likely some correspondence about the wedding. Placing it on the counter, he took a seat across from her, his usual commanding presence softened by something more personal. "Martha," he began, his voice calm, "I know this isn't easy for you. I can see it in the way you've been avoiding me lately." Her hands paused over the teapot she was preparing. She didn't meet his eyes, instead focusing on pouring the hot water with precision. "I haven't been avoiding you, Mr. Bennet," she replied evenly, though her voice lacked conviction. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You're not just my housekeeper, you never were, and I need you to understand that." His words carried a weight that struck a chord deep within her. She placed the teapot on the table, her hands resting on its edge. "But I am your housekeeper," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what everyone will see." "Let them," James replied firmly. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I care about who's there for me when it matters. And that's you." Martha looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the guarded wall she had built over the years faltered. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the quiet plea for her to step into a role she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. Before she could respond, Margaret entered the room, her usual energy filling the space. "Oh, good, you're both here," she said, placing a small box on the counter. "Martha, I brought this for you." Martha frowned as she opened the box, revealing a delicate shawl with intricate lacework. Its soft, muted tones complemented the dress perfectly. "Margaret, you've done too much already," she protested. "Nonsense," Margaret said with a dismissive wave. "It's a gift, not a bribe, though if it sways your decision, I won't complain." James chuckled softly, his eyes flickering with amusement. "She's relentless, isn't she?" Margaret shot him a pointed look. "Someone has to be." As Margaret left the room, James turned back to Martha. "She's right, you know," he said quietly. "This isn't just about the wedding. It's about taking a step towards something more." Martha studied his face, the faint lines of stress and the warmth that softened his usual stoic demeanor. "And what is that something more?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. James hesitated, then smiled faintly. "That's for you to decide, but whatever it is, I'll be there." Her heart swelled at his words, though the fear of stepping outside her carefully constructed life still loomed. Yet for the first time, she felt a seed of courage take root. Perhaps James saw something in her that she had yet to see in herself. As he left the room, Martha stood alone, the shawl draped over her arm. She ran her fingers over the delicate lace. imagining the life it represented, a life where she could stand by James's side, not as an employee, but as a person who belonged. That evening, as she prepared for bed, she placed the dress and shawl carefully on the back of her chair. They were no longer just garments, they were symbols of a choice she was beginning to make, and while the final step still felt daunting, she knew one thing for certain. James had planted a seed of belief in her, one that she could no longer ignore. The weeks leading to the Prescott wedding passed swiftly, yet each day felt heavier with anticipation. The Bennett mansion thrummed with quiet preparation. Martha, though immersed in her usual tasks, felt a subtle shift in her routine. It wasn't just the household that was changing, it was her place within it. On the morning of the wedding, sunlight filtered through the curtains of her attic room, casting golden beams on the navy dress and shawl draped neatly over her chair. The sight made her chest tighten. Today was the day, and the gravity of her decision pressed down on her. Downstairs, James paced in the grand foyer, checking his watch occasionally. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit, his presence commanding yet subdued. When Martha descended the staircase, he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression softening as she came into view. She wore the dress Margaret had given her, the shawl delicately draped over her shoulders. Her hair, usually pinned in a simple bun, was styled into soft waves that framed her face. She looked both elegant and hesitant, as though she were stepping into a role she had long avoided. "You look stunning," James said, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and admiration. "I knew the dress would suit you, but you're perfect." Martha blushed, her hands smoothing the fabric nervously. "It's the dress, not me," she murmured. James stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "No, Martha, it's you. The dress just highlights what's always been there." His words hung between them, unspoken emotions surfacing for a brief moment before they were interrupted by the sound of Margaret's voice echoing through the hall. "Well, don't you two look like a pair of royals?" she teased, descending the stairs with a sly smile. James rolled his eyes, but there was no hiding his amusement. "Are you here to see us off, or to deliver more unsolicited advice?" "Both," Margaret quipped, handing James his coat. She turned to Martha, her expression softening. "You'll do just fine, Martha. Just remember, confidence is everything." Martha nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. As James opened the door to escort her to the waiting car, she glanced back at Margaret, who gave her a reassuring smile and a quick thumbs up. The ride to the wedding venue was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound between them. James, sensing her tension, finally broke the silence. "You don't have to say much when we get there," he said, his tone calm. "Just be yourself. That's all I need." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. Still, her thoughts raced as they approached the grand estate where the wedding was being held. The towering gates opened to reveal manicured lawns and a sprawling mansion that made even James's home seem modest. As they stepped out of the car, Martha's nerves threatened to overtake her. The guests, dressed in their finest, were already gathering on the marble steps leading to the entrance. Their laughter and conversations carried through the crisp air, a stark contrast to the tight knot forming in Martha's chest. James offered her his arm, his calm presence anchoring her. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady. She took a deep breath, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "As I'll ever be," she replied. Together, they walked toward the crowd, their entrance drawing curious glances and murmurs. Martha could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but she focused on James, his confidence and unwavering composure giving her the courage to take each step. Inside, the grand hall was a spectacle of luxury, with glittering chandeliers and tables adorned with floral arrangements. The room was a swirl of color and movement, yet Martha's presence alongside James caused a ripple. Guests paused their conversations to take notice, their expressions ranging from curiosity to subtle judgment. James leaned closer to her, his voice low. "Ignore them. They don't matter." Martha nodded, though her heart raced. For the first time, she felt the full force of the world James had left behind, and the quiet strength it took for him to face it now. As they moved deeper into the room, Martha realized that this was more than just a wedding. It was a test, not of appearances, but of courage. And though her steps were tentative, they carried her into a space she had never thought she would enter, with a man who, in his quiet way, had shown her that she belonged. The moment Martha and James crossed the threshold of the Prescott estate, the opulence of the event enveloped them. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, and the murmurs of conversation mingled with the strains of a live string quartet. Waitstaff glided through the crowd with silver trays of champagne, their movements as seamless as the decor. Martha's heart raced as she clutched the edge of her shawl, her fingers tightening around the delicate lace. Every glance in their direction felt amplified, every whispered comment an echo she couldn't quite decipher. Yet, James remained composed, his calm demeanor steadying her. "James, darling," a voice called out, cutting through the hum of the crowd. Turning, they saw a tall, impeccably dressed man approaching with open arms. It was Henry Ashford, an old acquaintance of James, and a man whose charm was as polished as his appearance. "Henry," James greeted him with a firm handshake. "Good to see you." Henry's eyes shifted to Martha, his brows lifting in pleasant surprise. "And who is this vision by your side?" Martha felt her cheeks warm, but James didn't miss a beat. "This is Martha," he said simply, his tone carrying a quiet authority. "She's with me." Henry extended his hand to her, his smile disarming. "Martha, a pleasure. I must say, you're a breath of fresh air in a room like this." His words were kind, but they only heightened Martha's awareness of how different she felt from everyone else in the room. She managed a polite smile, shaking his hand with a grip that betrayed her nerves. As Henry moved on to greet other guests, James leaned toward Martha, his voice low. "You're doing fine." "Just breathe," Martha nodded, forcing herself to focus on his calm presence rather than the swirl of luxury and judgment around her. They made their way through the hall, exchanging polite nods and brief greetings, though the whispers and sidelong glances were impossible to ignore. At one point, they passed a group of elegantly dressed women gathered near a floral display. Their laughter quieted as Martha and James approached, their eyes raking over her in a way that made her feel exposed. One of the women, a statuesque blonde with a sharp smile, leaned toward her companion and murmured something that elicited a stifled laugh. Though Martha couldn't hear the words, the message was clear. She straightened her posture, willing herself not to shrink under their scrutiny. James noticed the exchange and placed a reassuring hand over hers, his touch grounding her. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They thrive on making people feel small." Martha nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. She had prepared herself for judgment, but the reality of it was sharper than she had imagined. As they moved toward the reception area, a server approached with glasses of champagne. James took one and handed another to Martha, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "To surviving the first hour," he said with a faint smile. Martha managed a small laugh, clinking her glass against his. The champagne was crisp and effervescent, its brightness a brief reprieve from the tension. Gradually, the initial shock of the environment began to dull. Martha found herself observing rather than reacting, taking in the lavish decorations, the intricate gowns, and the subtle power plays unfolding among the guests. She realized that beneath the veneer of elegance, this world was just as flawed and uncertain as any other. As the evening progressed, Martha felt a surprising shift. She began to engage in brief conversations, her natural warmth drawing the attention of those curious enough to approach. One guest, an older gentleman with kind eyes, asked her about her background, and Martha spoke honestly, though carefully, about her work and life. His genuine interest and lack of pretense reminded her that not everyone in this world was as judgmental as she had feared. When the time came for dinner, James led her to their table near the center of the room. The place settings were immaculate, each detail a testament to the extravagance of the evening. As Martha settled into her seat, she realized that, despite her nerves, she had made it through the first part of the night. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a small spark of pride. Looking at James beside her, his calm confidence unwavering, she felt a flicker of gratitude. He had invited her into this world not to challenge her, but to show her that she belonged, not because of her attire or her social standing, but because of who she was. The evening was far from over, but for the first time, Martha began to believe that she might be capable of navigating this unfamiliar terrain. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The grand dining hall was a spectacle of opulence. Towering floral arrangements adorned every table, their delicate fragrance mingling with the tantalizing aroma of the first course being served. Martha sat beside James, her hands resting on the edge of the white linen tablecloth, her posture tense but composed. Around her, the conversations ebbed and flowed, an intricate dance of words meant to impress, charm, or subtly undermine. James leaned toward her, his voice low. "Relax, Martha. You're doing great." She nodded slightly, though her heart still raced. The glittering crowd felt like a sea of judgment, and every glance in her direction seemed sharper than it probably was. She took a sip of water, willing herself to focus on something smaller: the clinking of silverware, the soft rustle of fabric, the steady rhythm of her breathing. As the waitstaff placed the appetizers before them, a woman across the table broke the silence. "James," she began, her tone dripping with feigned curiosity, "it's been years since we've seen you at one of these events. What changed your mind?" Martha recognized the woman from earlier, one of the group that had whispered as she passed. Her name, Martha learned, was Lila Hawthorne, a prominent figure in Boston's elite circles. James met Lila's gaze without flinching. "Sometimes it's worth revisiting the past," he replied smoothly, though his voice carried an undertone of challenge. Lila's eyes flicked briefly to Martha before returning to James. "And who might this charming companion be?" she asked, her smile thin. Before James could respond, Martha found her voice, steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I'm Martha," she said simply, meeting Lila's gaze. "It's nice to meet you." Lila's smile faltered just for a moment before she recovered. "Martha," she repeated, her tone polite but dismissive. "How lovely." The conversation moved on, but the exchange left Martha feeling both emboldened and exposed. She glanced at James, who gave her a subtle nod of approval. It was a small victory, but one that mattered. As the courses progressed, Martha began to observe the dynamics at play. The guests spoke in measured tones, their words carefully chosen to signal status, alliances, or subtle jabs. James navigated it effortlessly, his charisma and intellect drawing admiration and, in some cases, envy. Martha couldn't help but marvel at his ease in this world, even as she felt like an outsider. At one point, Henry Ashford joined their table, his presence a welcome distraction. He engaged Martha in conversation, his genuine curiosity a balm to her nerves. They spoke about books, a subject Martha felt comfortable with, and his easy manner allowed her to momentarily forget the scrutiny of the room. "I must say," Henry remarked with a smile, "you're far more interesting than anyone else here tonight." Martha blushed, though she couldn't help but smile. "I think that says more about the company you keep," she replied, surprising herself with the hint of humor in her voice. James, who had been listening quietly, chuckled. "Careful, Henry. You might have some competition." The moment lightened the atmosphere, drawing a few amused glances from nearby guests. Martha felt a flicker of confidence. Perhaps she wasn't as out of place as she had feared. As the evening wore on, Martha noticed Caroline enter the room. Dressed in an exquisite gown that shimmered under the chandelier's light, she was the center of attention. Her movements were graceful, her smile radiant, but to Martha there was something performative about it. Caroline's eyes swept the room, and when they landed on James, her smile faltered briefly before she regained her composure. She made her way toward their table, her steps measured and deliberate. "Martha," James said softly, his tone a quiet warning. "I see her," Martha replied, her voice calm but firm. She straightened her posture, steeling herself for whatever was to come. Caroline reached their table, her smile dazzling as she addressed James. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, her voice sweet but with a hint of sharpness. "I didn't expect to see you here." James stood, his expression polite but distant. "It's your wedding, Caroline. I wouldn't miss it." Her eyes flicked to Martha, and the polite mask slipped just enough for a flicker of disdain to show. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity and something darker. Martha stood as well, meeting Caroline's gaze. "I'm Martha," she said simply, her voice steady. "It's nice to meet you." Caroline's smile tightened, but she said nothing. The brief exchange left a ripple in the room's atmosphere, the tension palpable. As Caroline moved on, James placed a reassuring hand on Martha's arm. "You handled that perfectly," he said quietly. Martha exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing against her. She had stepped into a world filled with complexities and unspoken rules. But she had stood her ground. For the first time, she began to see that her strength was not in blending in, but in being unapologetically herself. As the evening progressed, Martha's senses adjusted to the rhythms of the Prescott wedding. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of designer gowns, and the murmur of conversations began to feel less overwhelming. She moved alongside James with quiet confidence, her initial unease giving way to a growing sense of self-possession. For every scrutinizing glance, there were genuine smiles, and for every veiled remark, there were moments of surprising warmth. It was during one such moment that Martha found herself standing near a cluster of guests, while James stepped away to greet an old colleague. She felt the familiar twinge of discomfort as she sipped her champagne, unsure whether to join the conversation or retreat. Before she could decide, a kind voice broke through her thoughts. "You look like you could use an escape," the voice said. Martha turned to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a soft smile. She was elegantly dressed, but there was a groundedness about her that set her apart from the crowd. "I suppose I do," Martha admitted with a small laugh. "This isn't exactly my usual scene." The woman chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I gathered as much. Don't worry, I'm not one of them either. I'm Eleanor Prescott, Caroline's aunt, though I've never much cared for these grand affairs." Martha blinked, startled by the admission. Eleanor extended her hand, and Martha shook it, her tension easing slightly. "I'm Martha," she said. "It's nice to meet you." "Likewise," Eleanor replied, her gaze warm. "And if I may say so, you're a breath of fresh air in this sea of pretense. It's good to see James with someone who isn't afraid to stand out." Martha hesitated, unsure how to respond. Eleanor's words felt both complimentary and pointed, as if she saw more than Martha intended to reveal. Before Martha could reply, Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "Caroline and her friends can be a bit much." Don't let them rattle you. They thrive on appearances, but that's all they have." The honesty in Eleanor's tone caught Martha off guard, but it was a relief to hear someone speak so candidly. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Eleanor smiled again, then gestured toward a young woman in a server's uniform, passing by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "See that girl there? She's my favorite person in this room, works harder than all of these people combined, and still manages to smile through it." Martha followed Eleanor's gaze to the server, who was moving efficiently among the guests, her expression polite but focused. Something about the young woman's demeanor resonated with Martha, reminding her of her own years of quiet service. Later, as Martha stood near the edge of the room, she noticed the server struggling to balance her tray after being jostled by an oblivious guest. Without thinking, Martha stepped forward and caught the tray before it could topple, steadying it with both hands. "Thank you," the young woman said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and embarrassment. "You're welcome," Martha replied, offering a reassuring smile. "It's not easy navigating a room like this." The server laughed softly. "You have no idea." "Oh, I think I do," Martha said, her tone wry. The two exchanged a look of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared experiences. "I'm Clara," the server said, introducing herself. "Martha," she replied. "It's nice to meet you." As Clara continued her work, Martha felt a surprising sense of solidarity. It was a small connection, but it grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. Later, when James returned to her side, he noticed the subtle change in her demeanor. "You're smiling," he said, his voice laced with warmth. "I take it you've found something to like about this crowd?" "Not the crowd," she replied, glancing toward Eleanor and Clara. "Just a few people who make it bearable." James followed her gaze, his expression softening. "Sometimes, that's all it takes." The night carried on, and while Martha knew there were more challenges ahead, she began to feel a quiet confidence growing within her. Surrounded by opulence and pretense, she had found small but meaningful allies, proof that even in the most daunting of settings, authenticity could forge connections. And with James at her side, she felt more prepared than ever to face whatever lay ahead. The evening's progression had lulled Martha into a sense of cautious ease. She moved through the room with James, the tension in her shoulders slowly unraveling as she engaged in light conversations with Eleanor and a few others who had shown her kindness. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Martha sensed that the night's challenges were far from over. As the dessert course was served, a faint chime from the sound system called for attention. A man in a sharp tuxedo, Caroline's father, Thomas Prescott, tapped a microphone at the head of the room, commanding the guests' focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "thank you all for joining us to celebrate Caroline's special day. Before we proceed with the toasts, our radiant bride would like to say a few words." The room erupted into polite applause as Caroline stepped forward, her smile dazzling, but her eyes sharp as glass. She stood poised and radiant in her custom gown, every movement calculated to project grace and control. "Thank you, everyone," Caroline began, her voice honeyed but with a subtle edge. "It means so much to have all of you here tonight. As I reflect on the journey that brought me to this day, I'm reminded of the people who've played significant roles in shaping my life." Martha felt her stomach tighten. Something about Caroline's tone sent a chill through her, though she couldn't quite place why. "And of course," Caroline continued, her gaze sweeping the room before landing deliberately on James, "there are those who've taught me invaluable lessons about ambition, resilience, and knowing one's place." The remark hung in the air, subtle yet barbed. A murmur rippled through the room, and several heads turned toward James. Martha's grip on her champagne glass tightened, her heart pounding. James remained composed, his expression unreadable as he met Caroline's gaze. But Martha could feel the tension radiating from him, a barely perceptible shift in his posture that only someone who knew him well would notice. Caroline smiled sweetly, as though oblivious to the weight of her words. "James, I'm so glad you could join us tonight. It's always inspiring to see how far people can come with hard work and determination." The guests laughed lightly, some uncomfortably, others eagerly enjoying the spectacle. Martha's breath caught in her throat. It was a subtle humiliation, cloaked in politeness, but unmistakable to those who paid attention. Before she could stop herself, Martha set her glass down and rose from her seat. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Excuse me, Caroline," Martha said, her tone calm but firm. "I believe you're mistaken." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, the murmurs dying instantly as curiosity and shock took their place. Caroline's smile faltered, her brows lifting in feigned confusion. "Mistaken," Caroline repeated, her voice edged with incredulity. "I'm not sure what you mean." Martha took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "James's success has nothing to do with knowing his place. It has everything to do with his character, his intelligence, and his ability to overcome obstacles most of us could never imagine." The room held its collective breath. James looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: gratitude, surprise, admiration. "And as for lessons," Martha continued, her voice growing steadier, "perhaps we could all learn a few from James, about integrity, generosity, and humility." Caroline's smile turned brittle, but she quickly regained her composure. "How noble of you to defend him," she said smoothly. "And who might you be exactly?" Martha straightened her posture, her gaze unwavering. "I'm someone who's had the privilege of knowing James for many years, and if there's one thing I know, it's that he doesn't need your approval or anyone else's to know his worth." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, some impressed, others stunned. Caroline's expression hardened, but she said nothing more. Instead, she turned back to the microphone, her forced smile barely masking her frustration. "Thank you for your perspective," Caroline said, her tone clipped. "Now, let's continue with the toasts." As the attention shifted back to the front of the room, Martha returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. James leaned toward her, his voice low and steady. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that, but thank you." Martha nodded, her pulse still racing. "I couldn't just sit there," she whispered. She was out of line. James gave her a faint smile, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "She was, and you handled it better than I ever could." The rest of the room seemed to carry on as though nothing had happened, but Martha knew the tide had shifted. For better or worse, she had stepped into the spotlight, and there was no turning back now. The tension in the grand hall lingered like a low hum, even as the guests returned to their laughter and clinking glasses. Martha's hands rested on the tablecloth, her fingers tracing its intricate embroidery in an effort to steady herself. She felt the ripple of her words still moving through the room, and with it, the unfamiliar weight of standing out. James sat beside her, his demeanor calm, but his eyes quietly watchful. He leaned toward her slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You did something remarkable just now," he said. "I hope you know that." Martha managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing. "I don't know about remarkable. It just felt necessary," he nodded, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the necessary things are the hardest to do." The next course arrived, and the soft clatter of plates offered a brief reprieve. Martha allowed herself a few bites, though her appetite had all but vanished. She glanced around the room, observing the shifting dynamics among the guests. While some seemed to have dismissed the earlier exchange, others continued to cast curious glances her way, their whispers subtle but unmistakable. Across the table, Eleanor Prescott raised her glass in a quiet gesture of solidarity. The older woman's smile was warm and reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of the courage Martha had shown. Martha nodded in return, grateful for the small but meaningful support. As the evening progressed, Martha found herself pulled into a series of subtle but pointed conversations. Lila Hawthorne approached her during a lull in the dinner service, her expression carefully composed. "Martha," Lila began, her tone polite but tinged with condescension, "I must say, you've made quite an impression tonight." Martha met Lila's gaze, her shoulders straightening. "I suppose that depends on who you ask." Lila's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Indeed," she said, her tone clipped. "It's refreshing to see James with someone who's not afraid to speak her mind." "I find it's better than the alternative," Martha replied, her voice steady. "Silence doesn't often lead to change." Lila tilted her head, as though considering her words. "How insightful," she said finally, though her expression suggested she found it anything but, "Well, I suppose I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the evening." As Lila moved away, James returned to Martha's side, having excused himself briefly to speak with the event's host. He noticed the faint tension in her expression and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "She's a shark," he said, his tone wry. "Don't let her get to you." "I'm fine," Martha replied, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "It's just a lot." James nodded, his gaze softening. "I know, and you're handling it better than I ever could have." The evening's momentum shifted again as the music began, a live band taking over from the string quartet. Guests moved toward the dance floor, their laughter and energy filling the room. James turned to Martha, his expression lightening. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Martha hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "I'm not much of a dancer," she admitted. "Neither am I," James replied with a faint smile. "But I promise not to step on your toes." After a moment's pause, she placed her hand in his, allowing him to guide her to the edge of the dance floor. The music was slow and elegant, the kind of melody that seemed to wrap around them like a soft embrace. James rested his hand gently on her waist, leading her with an ease that surprised her. As they swayed to the music, the noise of the room seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of the song and the steady warmth of James's presence. For the first time that evening, Martha felt herself relax, the tension in her shoulders melting away. "You're better at this than you let on," she said softly, a hint of teasing in her voice. James chuckled. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." Martha smiled, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, the weight of the evening felt lighter, the scrutiny of the crowd less significant. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she belonged, not because of her dress or her words, but because of the connection she shared with James. As the song ended and they returned to their table, Martha noticed Clara, the young server she had met earlier, watching from the corner of the room. The girl offered a small, encouraging smile, and Martha felt a spark of pride. Her actions tonight had rippled further than she realized, touching not just James but others who saw her as a quiet source of strength. The challenges of the evening were far from over, but Martha knew she had passed her first true test. She had faced judgment, subtle hostility, and the weight of expectations, and she had emerged with her dignity and integrity intact. For the first time, She began to believe that she might be stronger than even she had imagined. The rhythmic hum of conversations, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses, filled the grand hall as Martha sat quietly at the table. Though she appeared composed, a storm brewed beneath her calm exterior. The events of the evening, from Caroline's veiled insults to her own bold response, swirled in her mind, leaving her both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. She glanced at James, who was engaged in a conversation with an old colleague across the table. His relaxed demeanor stood in stark contrast to her own inner turmoil. How could he remain so composed, she wondered, while she felt as though every glance in the room was a judgment, every whispered word a condemnation. A waiter appeared, refilling her water glass. She offered him a polite smile, her thoughts still far away. It wasn't just the social scrutiny that weighed on her. It was the memory of a secret she had kept buried for so long. A secret that could shift the very foundation of the evening if revealed. Martha's mind drifted to the day she had stumbled upon Caroline's betrayal years ago. She had been dusting shelves in James's study when the muffled voices caught her attention. The laughter, followed by hurried whispers, led her to a room she had no intention of entering. Yet through a crack in the door, she had seen Caroline and James's closest friend in an embrace that left no room for doubt. She had kept silent, convinced that revealing the truth would bring James more pain than he could bear. And when Caroline ended the engagement shortly after, Martha had chosen to let the matter lie, hoping time would heal the wounds. But now, watching Caroline move effortlessly through the crowd, basking in admiration, Martha wondered if her silence had been a mistake. "Penny for your thoughts?" James's voice interrupted her reverie. He had returned to his seat, his expression warm but curious. Martha forced a smile, shaking her head. "Nothing important," she said, though the weight in her chest begged to differ. He studied her for a moment, then leaned closer, his tone dropping. "You've been quiet. If this is about earlier, what Caroline said, you handled it perfectly. You have nothing to worry about." "It's not that," Martha replied softly, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle at the center of the table. I keep wondering if there's more I could do." James frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. "More you could do? Martha, you've already done more than I could have asked for. Just being here means more to me than you know." His words brought a fleeting warmth, but they did little to ease the conflict within her. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "doing the right thing doesn't feel right at all." James tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "What are you trying to say?" Before she could answer, the sound of silverware tapping against glass drew their attention. Thomas Prescott was once again addressing the room, signaling the beginning of the toasts. Martha breathed a quiet sigh of relief, grateful for the reprieve, but the knot in her stomach tightened. The momentary distraction did little to quell the questions gnawing at her conscience. As the toast began, she watched Caroline from across the room. The bride's radiant smile masked the cunning she knew all too well. With each passing speech, Martha's resolve wavered. The truth burned within her, but so did the fear of what it could unleash, not just for Caroline, but for James, whose life had been shaped by the decisions she had made all those years ago. After the toasts concluded and the crowd erupted into applause, James turned back to her, his expression searching. "You're carrying something," he said quietly. "I can see it. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Martha hesitated, her throat tightening. The temptation to unburden herself was strong, but so was the fear of what her words might do. She looked into James's eyes, seeing the unwavering trust that had built between them over the years. Could she risk shattering it? "I'm fine," she said finally. her voice steadier than she felt. "It's just been a long night." James didn't press further, though his concern lingered in his gaze. "If you're sure," he said, leaning back in his chair. As the night wore on, Martha felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The truth had lived in the shadows for so long, yet the evening had brought it dangerously close to the surface. For the first time, she questioned whether her silence had been an act of protection or a quiet betrayal. The room seemed to blur around her as she struggled with the moral dilemma. What was more important, sparing James the pain of a past betrayal or giving him the truth he deserved? The question lingered, unanswered, as the night unfolded around her. The lively hum of the wedding reception faded into a muted backdrop as Martha sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of her secret pressed against her chest like a stone. Around her, laughter and music filled the grand hall, but she felt as though she were underwater, her surroundings distorted and distant. James noticed her silence, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're far away again," he said gently, leaning closer so only she could hear. "If something's wrong, you can tell me." Martha hesitated, her heart pounding. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Caroline's voice cut through the air, drawing their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline began, standing at the head of the room with a glass of champagne in hand, "I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight. This day is about love, family, and new beginnings, but it's also about reflection." Martha's grip on her napkin tightened. Caroline's gaze swept the room, lingering just a fraction too long on James before continuing. "I'm reminded of the choices we make and the people who shape our lives along the way. Some, of course, teach us lessons we'll carry forever." The remark, though veiled in civility, was sharp and unmistakable. A ripple of murmurs passed through the guests. James's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening. Martha felt her chest tighten with indignation, but her voice caught in her throat. Caroline raised her glass higher, her smile gleaming like polished glass. "To those who've been part of our journey, whether for a reason, a season, or a lifetime, we thank you." Polite applause followed, but the tension in the air was palpable. James remained motionless, his expression unreadable, while Martha's mind raced. Caroline's words were calculated, designed to wound without ever appearing overtly cruel, and they had succeeded. Unable to remain seated any longer, Martha rose abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. James turned to her, concern flashing in his eyes. "Martha, are you—" "I'll be back," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze as she stepped away from the table. She needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of her thoughts. She found herself in the garden outside the reception hall, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside. The stars above glittered like scattered diamonds, but even their beauty did little to calm her racing heart. Martha leaned against a marble balustrade, her hands gripping its edge as she fought to steady her breathing. She had thought herself strong enough to endure the evening, but Caroline's pointed remarks had reignited the conflict she had struggled to bury. The truth she had kept for so long now felt like a fire raging within her, demanding to be released. Footsteps approached from behind, and she turned to see James stepping into the garden. His expression was a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Martha," he said softly, "what's going on?" She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I just needed a moment." James came closer, his gaze steady. "This isn't like you. Talk to me." Martha looked away, her hands gripping the balustrade tighter. She wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the secret that had weighed on her for years. But the fear of his reaction, the possibility of shattering their bond, kept her silent. She began, her voice faltering. There's something I've been holding on to, something I thought I was protecting you from, but now I'm not so sure." James frowned, his concern deepening. "Martha, whatever it is, you can tell me. You know that, right?" She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. The trust in his gaze was unwavering, and for a moment she felt a glimmer of courage, but the words wouldn't come. The memory of that day, of Caroline's betrayal, loomed too large, its implications too devastating. Martha took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I didn't want to see you hurt." James stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Martha," he said softly, "I've faced my share of pain. Whatever it is, I can handle it. But I can't help if you don't let me in." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, her throat tightening. "It's not that simple," she whispered. James's expression softened, but his voice was firm. "It never is. But you've stood by me through everything. Let me do the same for you." Martha's resolve wavered, the barrier she had built around her secret beginning to crack. But before she could speak, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Eleanor appeared, her expression calm but concerned. "There you two are," Eleanor said gently. "I came to check on you. Everything all right?" Martha quickly wiped her eyes, nodding. "Yes, just needed a breather." Eleanor glanced between them, her sharp intuition clearly sensing the unspoken tension. "Well," she said after a pause, "don't stay out too long. The speeches are wrapping up, and I believe Caroline has something else planned." James nodded, offering a polite smile. "We'll be in soon." As Eleanor left, James turned back to Martha, his expression still searching. "This conversation isn't over," he said quietly. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Martha nodded, though her chest ached with the weight of her indecision. The insurmountable conflict within her remained unresolved, and as they re-entered the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, once spoken, would change everything. The reception hall was alive with music and laughter as Martha and James re-entered, the golden light casting a warm glow over the glittering crowd. But for Martha, the warmth was superficial. The secret she carried burned within her, a weight she could no longer ignore. Each step toward the table felt heavier than the last. James, ever attentive, remained close by her side. Though he said nothing, his quiet presence was a steadying force. Yet Martha knew his patience, though vast, would eventually demand answers she wasn't ready to give. As they resumed their seats, Caroline was once again in the center of attention, her laughter ringing out like a crystal bell. She was radiant and poised, her charm enveloping those around her. But to Martha, every word she spoke, every graceful movement, was a reminder of the betrayal that had reshaped James's life. Unable to stomach the charade any longer, Martha turned to James. "Excuse me," she murmured, rising once more. James's brow furrowed. "Martha, I just need a moment," she said, her voice tight. Without waiting for his response, she slipped away, weaving through the tables and out into the quiet corridor beyond the reception hall. She found herself in a smaller, dimly lit parlor, its walls lined with bookshelves and its air heavy with the scent of aged leather. Closing the door behind her, she leaned against it, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. The night had stretched her resolve to its limit, and the truth she had buried for so long threatened to break free. A soft knock startled her. She turned to see Eleanor entering the room, her expression gentle but probing. "Forgive the intrusion," Eleanor said softly, closing the door behind her, "but I had a feeling you might need someone to talk to." Martha hesitated, her instinct to retreat clashing with the need to unburden herself. Eleanor's presence, though unexpected, felt oddly comforting. "You've been watching all night, haven't you?" Martha asked quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Eleanor nodded, her own smile wry. I've spent a lifetime navigating rooms like this. You learn to read people quickly. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. And I can see that something is eating away at you. Martha sank into a nearby chair, her hands gripping its arms. I've been holding on to something for years, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something I thought would protect James. But now I wonder if I made the wrong choice. Eleanor sat across from her, her expression both kind and intent. Whatever it is, I suspect it's weighed on you long enough. Perhaps it's time to let it go. Martha's throat tightened as the words she had kept hidden clawed their way to the surface. Caroline, she said finally, her voice trembling, before she ended her engagement with James, I saw her with someone else. James's best friend at the time. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, though her composure remained intact. You mean she betrayed him, Martha said, the words spilling out like a flood. I saw it with my own eyes, but I didn't tell him. I couldn't. He was already hurting, and I thought sparing him that pain was the right thing to do. Eleanor leaned back, her expression contemplative. And now I see her standing there, acting as though she's untouchable, as though she's never wronged anyone. Martha's voice grew steadier, her anger lending her strength. And I wonder if I've been complicit in her lies by staying silent. Eleanor reached out, placing a hand over Martha's. What you did was out of love and protection, but sometimes silence can be as heavy as the truth. Only you can decide whether breaking that silence is worth the risk. Martha closed her eyes, Eleanor's words resonating deeply. She had always believed her silence was an act of care, but now she wondered if it had allowed Caroline to escape accountability, while James carried the weight of their broken engagement alone. A sudden knock interrupted their conversation. The door opened, and James stepped inside, his expression tense but concerned. "Martha," he said, his voice low, "are you all right?" Eleanor rose, giving Martha's hand a gentle squeeze before stepping toward James. "She's fine," she said, her tone reassuring. "Just a bit overwhelmed. I'll give you two a moment." As Eleanor exited, James crossed the room, his presence filling the quiet space. He sat beside Martha, his gaze searching hers. "You've been distant all night," he said softly. "If something's wrong, you need to tell me." Martha's heart pounded. The truth she had carried for years was on the tip of her tongue, begging to be released. She looked into James's eyes, seeing the trust and care that had built between them over decades. Could she risk shattering it now? "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Something I should have told you years ago." James leaned forward, his expression steady and patient. "Whatever it is, I'm here." Martha drew a deep breath, her hands clutching her lap. The moment of revelation was upon her, and as the truth prepared to take shape in words, she braced herself for whatever came next. The weight of the moment pressed down on Martha as she sat across from James in the quiet parlor. The air between them seemed almost still, charged with an unspoken tension. James leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on his knees, his expression open yet expectant. Martha clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her heart hammering. "James," she began, her voice wavering, "there's something I've been carrying for a long time, something I should have told you before, but I thought keeping it from you was protecting you." James's brows knitted slightly, but he said nothing, giving her the space to continue. His calm patience only made the knot in her stomach tighten further. "It's about Caroline," she said, her throat tightening around the name, "and the time before your engagement ended." His gaze sharpened, though he didn't speak. His stillness, The way his body tensed just slightly told Martha he knew she was about to deliver something significant. Martha inhaled deeply, the memory of that fateful day flooding back with painful clarity. "I saw her," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "With someone else. It was your best friend at the time, Elliot." James's expression didn't change immediately. He sat back slightly, his eyes narrowing as the words sank in. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment Martha wondered if she had made a grave mistake. "You saw them," James said at last, his voice low, controlled. "Together." Martha nodded, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to, but I walked past the study and saw them. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, James. It was undeniable." He looked away, his jaw tightening. Martha's heart ached at the sight of him, the man she had respected and cared for so deeply, confronting a truth he never asked for. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite name, hurt, perhaps, or disbelief. "I didn't want to cause you more pain," she said, her voice trembling. "You were already struggling with the pressure of the engagement, the expectations from her family, and your own dreams. I thought sparing you that betrayal would help you move on." James stood abruptly, pacing the small room. His hands moved to his hips, then back to his sides, as though he didn't quite know what to do with them. Martha stayed seated, giving him the space she sensed he needed. "Elliot," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I trusted him with everything." Martha swallowed hard. "I should have told you sooner, James. I see that now. But at the time, I was afraid it would break you." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And carrying it all these years didn't break you?" Martha's breath caught. His words weren't accusatory, but filled with a quiet anguish that cut through her defenses. She stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It wasn't my place to decide what you could or couldn't handle," she said softly. "And for that, I'm sorry." James studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense but not unkind. "You thought you were protecting me," he said finally. "And maybe you were, but Martha..." He paused, exhaling deeply. "You're the one person I trust completely. To know you kept this from me..." "I know," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know I let you down. But please believe me, James. I did it because I cared about you, because I didn't want you to carry that hurt." The silence that followed was heavy, but not unbearable. James crossed the room, his movements slower now, and stopped just in front of her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch both steadying and forgiving. "I don't know what I would have done back then," he admitted. "Maybe you were right to spare me, but hearing it now..." He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't hurt the way I thought it might. It just clarifies." Martha blinked, her breath catching. "Clarifies?" James gave a faint, rueful smile. "It confirms what I've suspected for years, that Caroline and I were never meant to last. That she was part of my past, not my future." His words, though spoken calmly, carried a sense of finality. Martha felt a flood of relief, mixed with the lingering guilt of having kept the truth from him for so long. "You didn't have to tell me this tonight," James said, his voice softening, "but I'm glad you did." She met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, something that had always been there, but now seemed to shimmer with clarity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for understanding." James stepped back, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about understanding, Martha. It's about trust. And if there's one thing I've never doubted, it's you." The words hung in the air, a balm to the wounds of the past. For the first time in years, Martha felt a lightness she hadn't known she was missing. The truth, though painful, had finally set them free. As the distant hum of the reception called them back, James extended his arm. "Shall we?" he asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. Martha hesitated, then slipped her hand through his arm. Together, they stepped back into the light, the weight of the past left behind in the quiet of the parlor. For the first time, the future seemed not only possible, but bright. The glow of the chandeliers seemed brighter as Martha and James re-entered the reception hall, the noise of the crowd enveloping them. Though the truth she had carried for so long was finally out, Martha's nerves hadn't yet settled. Her heart raced as her eyes scanned the room for Caroline, knowing that what came next could not be avoided. James A2 was more composed than she had expected, though there was a quiet intensity about him that hadn't been there earlier. His jaw tightened as his gaze landed on Caroline, who was surrounded by a cluster of guests, her laughter ringing out as though nothing in the world could touch her. "I need to speak with her," James said, his voice calm but resolute. "You don't have to come." Martha shook her head, her hand tightening on his arm. "I'm with you." He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment before the steely determination returned. Together, they made their way across the hall, the crowd parting slightly as James's presence commanded attention. Caroline spotted them before they reached her, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she composed herself. "James," she said brightly, stepping forward with her glass raised, "and Martha, I trust you're both enjoying the evening." James's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Caroline hesitated, glancing at the curious onlookers around them. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth. "Shall we step outside?" James gestured for her to lead the way. Martha followed close behind, her heart pounding as they exited onto the wide veranda overlooking the manicured gardens. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the warmth of the hall, and the distant hum of music provided a strange backdrop to the confrontation that was about to unfold. Caroline turned to face them, her smile still in place but her eyes wary. "This seems serious," she said lightly, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. "It is," James replied, his tone measured but firm. "I've learned something tonight that I should have known years ago." Caroline's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "I'm not sure what you mean." James took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I'm talking about you and Elliot." At the mention of the name, Caroline's composure cracked. Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at Martha, whose presence seemed to add weight to the accusation. "James," Caroline began, her voice tinged with indignation. "Whatever you think you know, I know the truth," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest. "And I have Martha to thank for finally telling me." Caroline's gaze snapped to Martha, her expression shifting from surprise to something darker. "Martha," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you're the one feeding him lies now." Martha stepped forward, her own resolve hardening. "They're not lies, Caroline. I saw you. I saw what you did. And I kept quiet because I thought it would protect him." Caroline scoffed, her facade of grace slipping further. "You kept quiet because you knew it wasn't your place, and it still isn't." "It is now," Martha replied, her voice steady, "because he deserves to know the truth." James raised a hand, silencing the escalating exchange. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Caroline, I trusted you. I was ready to build a life with you, and you betrayed that trust in the worst way." Caroline's bravado faltered, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. "James, it was years ago," she said, her tone softening as she reached for him. "We were young, we made mistakes, but look where we are now. I've moved on, and so have you." James took a step back, his expression unyielding. "You moved on without consequence. You carried on with your life as though nothing happened, while I spent years wondering what I had done wrong. That ends tonight." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Caroline's hand dropped to her side, and for a moment she seemed to deflate. Then, with a flick of her hair and a forced smile, she straightened her posture. "Well," she said, her voice brittle but composed, "I suppose congratulations are in order. It seems you've finally found someone who's willing to fight your battles for you." Martha opened her mouth to respond, but James spoke first. "Martha isn't fighting my battles," he said, his voice steady. "She's standing beside me, and that's more than you ever did." Caroline's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked back into the reception hall, her head held high even as the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. For a moment, silence fell over the veranda. James let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. He turned to Martha, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Martha shook her head. "You deserved the truth, James. I'm just sorry it took me so long." He stepped closer, his gaze warm. "You've never let me down, Martha. Not once." As the music drifted through the open doors, James extended his hand to her. "Shall we rejoin the party?" Martha hesitated, then placed her hand in his. Together, they walked back into the light, leaving the shadows of the past behind. For the first time in years, Martha felt the weight of her silence lifted, replaced by the quiet strength of truth and trust. The buzz of the reception seemed muted as Martha and James re-entered the hall. The confrontation with Caroline still echoed in Martha's mind, but there was a strange sense of peace that accompanied it. The weight of the truth she had carried for so long had finally been lifted, leaving room for something new, clarity, perhaps, or even closure. James walked beside her, his steps steady and deliberate. He appeared calm, but Martha could sense the quiet storm beneath his composed exterior. She knew this wasn't the end of his reckoning with the past, only the beginning. Yet for now, there was no need for words. The silence between them was one of understanding. As they approached their table, Eleanor intercepted them, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "That looked intense," she said, glancing between them. "Everything all right?" James gave a faint smile. "It's done," he said simply, "and it needed to be." Eleanor nodded, her sharp eyes softening as they landed on Martha. "Good. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that free us the most." Martha felt a wave of gratitude for Eleanor's presence, her quiet support a balm in the midst of the evening's chaos. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than she could express. Eleanor gave a small smile, then turned to James. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." With that, she stepped away, leaving them alone once more. The band struck up a new tune, a lively melody that drew many of the guests to the dance floor. James watched the scene for a moment, then turned to Martha. "Do you want to sit, or—" Martha shook her head. "I think I'd like some air." James nodded, and together they made their way to a quieter corner of the garden, away from the bright lights and watchful eyes. The cool night air was refreshing, the scent of blooming roses a welcome contrast to the intensity of the evening. They found a small bench tucked beneath a canopy of ivy. James sat first, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared out at the softly illuminated grounds. Martha joined him, her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable, a chance to process everything that had unfolded. Finally, James broke the silence. "I spent years wondering what I did wrong," he said, his voice low. "Why she left the way she did. I thought maybe I wasn't enough." Martha turned to him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "James, it was never about you," she said gently. Caroline's choices were hers alone. You deserved better than what she gave you. He nodded, though his expression remained distant. Hearing the truth tonight, it doesn't change what happened, but it does bring clarity. For the first time, I feel like I can let it go. Martha hesitated, then reached out to place her hand over his. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You always have been. James turned to her, his gaze softening. And you've always been there, haven't you? Even when I didn't realize it. She smiled faintly. It's easy to be there for someone you care about. The words hung between them, their simplicity carrying a depth neither of them had fully acknowledged before. James's eyes searched her, as though trying to read something she wasn't yet ready to say. You've always been more than a housekeeper, Martha, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been my friend, my constant. Her breath caught at his words, the sincerity in his tone leaving her momentarily speechless. And you've been mine, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Even when you didn't know it. The quiet that followed was filled with unspoken understanding, a bond forged over years of shared moments, silent support, and unyielding trust. For the first time, Martha allowed herself to believe that their connection was something more than the roles they had played in each other's lives. The distant sound of laughter and music drifted through the air, but neither of them moved. In that moment, the past felt like a distant shadow, and the future shimmered with possibilities they hadn't dared to imagine. As the night deepened, James stood and offered his hand to Martha. Come on, he said with a faint smile. Let's finish this evening on our terms. She took his hand, the warmth of his touch grounding her. Together they returned to the reception, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had weathered the storms of their pasts and emerged stronger and closer than ever before. The glow of the reception hall welcomed Martha and James as they returned to the heart of the celebration. The music was lively, and the sound of laughter filled the air, yet to Martha the room felt different now. The confrontation with Caroline had shifted something within her, a quiet transformation that she hadn't fully realized until now. James walked beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. As they wove through the crowd, they drew curious glances, but Martha noticed them less and less. The weight of judgment that had felt so oppressive at the start of the evening now seemed insignificant. She no longer felt the need to shrink or blend into the background. She belonged here, not because of her title or status, but because of her integrity and the strength of her connection to James. They reached their table, where Eleanor waited with a glass of champagne in hand. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone light but knowing. James gave a faint smile. "We couldn't stay away from the party for too long." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Martha, her sharp eyes softening. "You've handled tonight with remarkable grace," she said, "more than most people in this room could manage." Martha smiled, the compliment settling warmly in her chest. "I've had good reason to." Eleanor nodded, her expression pleased, and raised her glass. "To courage, then." The toast was small, private, but it felt significant. As they clinked glasses, Martha realized that this moment marked the culmination of years of quiet strength, of choices made in silence that had finally been acknowledged. James leaned closer to her as Eleanor moved away to speak with another guest. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and laced with concern. Martha turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I am," she said simply. "For the first time in a long while, I feel free." James studied her, his gaze warm but searching. "You've always carried more than your share, Martha. I'm just sorry it took me so long to see it." She shook her head, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "You've always seen more than you let on, James, and you've always made it easier for me to carry what I needed to." The moment between them was brief but profound. The unspoken connection that had grown over decades seemed to solidify into something undeniable. Martha felt a quiet confidence settle within her, a sense of belonging not just to this moment, but to James's life in a way she hadn't dared to imagine before. The music shifted to a slower melody, and James turned to her, his hand extended. "Dance with me." Martha hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I'd like that." He led her to the dance floor, where the crowd had thinned as the night grew later. The soft strains of a piano and violin filled the air as they began to sway to the rhythm. James's hand rested lightly on her waist, and she felt the steadiness of his presence guiding her. "You've changed tonight," James said softly, his voice just loud enough for her to hear over the music. "You're different." Martha looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Different how?" "Stronger," he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not that you weren't strong before, but tonight you've shown everyone, including yourself, what I've always known. You're remarkable, Martha." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked away briefly before meeting his gaze again. "Maybe I've just stopped hiding," she said, "stopped believing I had to." James's smile deepened, and his grip on her waist tightened slightly, drawing her closer. "Whatever it is, I hope you never go back. The world deserves to see you as you are." The music swelled, and they continued to move together, their steps effortless and unhurried. Around them, the room seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of the dance and the warmth of their connection. As the song came to an end, James leaned down, his voice low and intimate. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." She looked up at him, her heart full. "You don't have to thank me, James. I'd do it all again." In that moment, the years of unspoken emotion between them crystallized into something undeniable. Though neither said the words, the bond they shared felt stronger than ever, a quiet promise of what was to come. As the applause for the band swelled around them, James took her hand and led her off the dance floor. The night was drawing to a close, but for Martha, it felt like the beginning of something new, a life unburdened by the past and filled with possibilities she was only just beginning to see. The reception hall, once buzzing with energy, began to quiet as the evening stretched into night. The crowd thinned, and the laughter and music softened into the background. Martha and James found themselves back at their table, surrounded by remnants of the evening, empty glasses, half-eaten desserts, and the faint perfume of the flowers that adorned the room. Martha sat quietly, her hand still resting lightly on James's arm from their walk back from the dance floor. The conversation with Caroline, the dance, and the weight of the evening's revelations still lingered between them. But it was no longer an oppressive presence. Instead, it felt like a bridge, something they had crossed together and left behind. Eleanor approached with a soft smile, her shoes in hand, clearly relieved to be free of them. "I think I'm officially too old for nights like these," she said with a chuckle, lowering herself into a chair beside Martha. "You've been wonderful," Martha replied, her smile warm. "Thank you for everything tonight." Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't thank me. You did the hard part. I just watched, and I must say you handled it beautifully." James chimed in, his voice light but sincere. "You always do seem to know when to appear, Eleanor. We're lucky to have you." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her smile mischievous. "Don't think I didn't notice the two of you on the dance floor. It's about time, if you ask me." Martha felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but James simply smiled, unfazed. "You're not wrong," he said, his gaze shifting to Martha. "It is about time." Eleanor patted his hand and stood, her expression softening. "Well, I'll leave you two to figure out the rest of your evening. Just remember, what's ahead matters more than what's behind." As she walked away, Martha turned to James, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you think she's always been this insightful?" "Always," James replied, leaning back in his chair. "And annoyingly so?" Martha laughed, the sound light and unguarded, and the tension that had lingered in her shoulders finally eased. She reached for her glass of water, taking a slow sip as she let herself settle into the moment. James's voice broke the silence, soft and contemplative. "You know, tonight could have gone differently." Martha looked at him, her head tilting slightly. "How so?" "I could have stayed silent," he admitted. "I could have ignored Caroline, let her continue as if nothing had ever happened. I've done it before, but I didn't. Because of you." She blinked, her heart skipping at his words. "Me?" James nodded, his gaze steady. "You've always been my constant, Martha. But tonight you reminded me that being constant doesn't mean being passive. You stood up, not just for me, but for the truth. And it gave me the courage to do the same." Martha felt her chest tighten, warmth spreading through her as she realized the depth of his words. "You've always had that courage, James," she said softly. "You just needed a reason to use it." He smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "You've always been that reason." The words hung between them, unspoken emotions crystallizing into a shared understanding. Martha reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his before settling into a quiet clasp. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had built together. The hall was nearly empty now, the remaining guests beginning to drift toward the exit. James glanced at his watch, then back at Martha. "It's late," he said. "Shall we?" Martha nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they walked toward the grand doors, she felt a quiet anticipation building within her, not for the end of the evening, but for what lay beyond it. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped outside, the estate's grand courtyard bathed in moonlight. The car waited at the bottom of the steps, its driver standing patiently by the open door. James paused, his hand resting lightly on Martha's arm. "Before we go," he said, his voice quiet, "there's something I want to ask." Martha turned to him, her expression curious. "What is it?" James hesitated for the briefest moment, then smiled. "Where do you see yourself tomorrow? Not just back at the house or at work. I mean, really see yourself." Martha blinked, caught off guard by the question. She had spent so long serving others, living within the boundaries of her role, that the thought of her own future felt foreign. But tonight had stirred something in her, a sense of possibility she hadn't dared to explore before. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft. "But for the first time, I'm excited to find out." James's smile deepened, and he extended his hand once more. "Then let's find out together." She placed her hand in his, and as they descended the steps, Martha felt a sense of lightness she hadn't known in years. The past had been laid to rest, and the future stretched out before them, uncharted, uncertain, but undeniably theirs to shape. The drive back to the Bennett estate was serene, the city lights fading into the quiet countryside. Martha leaned her head against the window, her reflection faint in the glass, as the car moved smoothly through the darkness. Beside her, James sat quietly, his presence steady and comforting. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, but now they felt distant, as though she had crossed an invisible threshold into something new. When the car pulled into the driveway of the sprawling mansion, the familiar sight of its towering silhouette against the night sky filled Martha with an unexpected sense of belonging. She stepped out of the car, her hand lightly brushing the fabric of her dress as James joined her. "Shall we go inside?" he asked, his voice low but warm. Martha hesitated, glancing up at the house. "Let's stay out here for a moment," she said softly. James nodded, his hand motioning toward the garden path. They walked side by side, the cool night air filled with the faint hum of crickets and the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. The moonlight illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. They reached a small bench beneath a towering oak tree, a spot they both knew well. James sat first, his elbows resting on his knees, and Martha joined him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" James asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful. Martha turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "With Caroline," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What if things had been different? What if I hadn't been so blind to who she really was?" Martha considered his question carefully before responding. "I think we all wonder about the what-ifs," she said gently. "But sometimes the things we think we've lost are just making room for something better." James's lips curved into a faint smile, and he turned to face her. "And what about you, Martha? Do you ever think about what might have been?" Her breath caught at the question. She had spent so many years focused on others, rarely allowing herself to consider her own path. But tonight had changed something within her. The courage she had found, the truth she had spoken, it had unlocked a part of her she hadn't realized was waiting to be set free. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but tonight I realized that the past doesn't have to define what comes next." James reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You've always seen more clearly than I have," he said softly, "even when I couldn't." She smiled, her heart swelling at his words. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for, James. You just needed a reason to see it." They sat in silence for a while longer, the cool breeze rustling the leaves above them. When James finally spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability beneath it that she hadn't heard before. "Martha," he began, "I've spent years building a life that I thought was complete. But tonight made me realize that I've been missing something or someone." Her heart skipped, her breath catching as she met his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued, "but I know I want you to be part of it, not as my housekeeper, but as someone who's always been more than that to me." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, a soft smile spreading across her face. "I've always been here, James," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and I always will be." He smiled, his hand tightening gently around hers. "Then let's stop looking back. Let's start building something new." As they sat together beneath the oak tree, the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, bathing the garden in soft, golden light. For the first time in years, Martha felt truly at peace, not just with the life she had lived, but with the one she was beginning to create. They rose together, their steps unhurried, as they made their way back toward the house. The past had been laid to rest, and the future stretched out before them, bright and full of promise. Together, they stepped through the front door, leaving behind the shadows of what might have been and embracing the quiet victory of what was. The morning light seeped through the tall windows of the Bennett estate, illuminating its grand halls with a gentle glow. The house felt different to Martha as she descended the stairs, her steps slower, more deliberate. For years, she had walked these halls as a quiet presence, fulfilling her duties with a steadfastness she thought would always define her. Today, she felt something shift, an awakening, a sense of belonging not tied to her role, but to herself. James was already in the kitchen, a rarity. He stood by the counter, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He looked up when Martha entered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "I hope you slept well." Martha nodded, a soft smile gracing her lips. "I did. Thank you." He gestured toward the table, where 2 plates of toast and fruit were arranged. "I thought I'd make breakfast. It seemed only fair after everything you did last night." She raised an eyebrow, her smile growing. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Bennett." "James," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities now, don't you?" Martha laughed softly and took a seat, the simple act feeling strangely intimate in the quiet morning. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the clinking of utensils the only sound between them, but Martha could feel James's gaze lingering, his thoughts clearly circling something unsaid. Finally, he set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Martha," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last night, about not letting the past define us." She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. And I realize that I've spent so much of my life building walls around my work, my home, even my heart." His eyes met hers, unwavering. "But you've always been the one person who could see past them. The one person I never had to hide from." Martha's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years quietly admiring James, her feelings tucked away in the safety of routine. To hear him speak so openly now felt like a dream she hadn't dared to dream. "I don't want to keep hiding," he continued. "Not from you, not from myself. I want us to move forward, not as we were, but as we could be." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she responded. "James, I've spent so much of my life standing in the background, afraid to want more, afraid to step out of the role I thought I had to play. But last night, you showed me that I don't have to hide either, that I can be more than I ever thought possible." His smile was soft, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Then let's stop hiding. Let's face whatever comes together." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken understanding, of shared moments that had built a foundation neither of them had fully realized until now. Martha felt her heart swell, a quiet joy blooming within her. They finished their breakfast slowly, savoring not just the meal, but the newfound ease between them. As the morning stretched on, the house began to stir, the quiet hum of life returning to its halls. But for Martha, everything felt different, brighter, more alive. Later, as she stood by the window overlooking the garden, James joined her, his presence warm and steady. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. She turned to him, her smile soft. "That this house feels more like home than it ever has." He nodded, his own smile growing. "Maybe that's because it finally is." They stood together in the golden morning light, the future stretching out before them. The past had shaped them, but it no longer defined them. Together, they were ready to build something new, something rooted in trust, respect, and the quiet strength they had found in each other. For the first time in years, Martha felt not just content, but truly hopeful. And as she looked at James, she knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The days that followed the wedding brought a calmness to the Bennett estate that Martha had never felt before. The tension that had once lingered in the air, the unspoken boundaries of employer and employee, seemed to dissolve like the morning mist. The mansion, once a symbol of duty and routine, began to feel like a shared space, more a home than it had ever been. Martha spent her mornings tending to the garden, her hands working the soil as her mind wandered to the events of the wedding. She had expected to feel exposed after revealing the truth about Caroline, but instead she felt lighter, as though the burden she had carried for years had finally been lifted. One morning, as she trimmed the roses, she heard James's voice calling her name from the house. He appeared moments later, his sleeves rolled up and a faint smile on his face. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, leaning against the garden gate. "You've been spending a lot of time out here lately." "It's peaceful," Martha replied, straightening and brushing the dirt from her gloves. "And I've had a lot to think about." James stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "I have too." Martha tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "And what have you been thinking about?" He hesitated for a moment, then met her gaze. "About how this house feels different now. Lighter, warmer. Because of you." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, focusing on a stray leaf she hadn't yet trimmed. "I don't think I've done much." James shook his head, stepping closer. "You've done everything, Martha. You've been the heart of this house for years, even when I didn't realize it. And now I see it more clearly than ever." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. She had spent so long seeing herself as just a part of the background, the caretaker of James's world. To hear him speak of her as something more felt both overwhelming and deeply affirming. "I've been thinking about something else too," James continued, his tone shifting to one of quiet determination. "It's time for change, not just for the house, but for us." Martha turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What kind of change?" James smiled, his eyes softening. "I don't want us to keep living in the past. I want to look forward, together." The words hung between them, carrying the weight of unspoken emotions and possibilities. Martha felt her heart quicken, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty blooming within her. "I've spent years building this life, this home," James said, his voice steady, "but it's never felt complete. Not until I realized what you mean to me. What you've always meant to me." Martha's breath caught, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. "James." He reached for her hands, his touch gentle but grounding. "I don't know where this will lead, Martha, but I do know one thing. I can't imagine it without you." Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was steady. "I've always been here, James, and I always will be." The words were simple, but they carried a depth that neither of them could deny. In that moment, the years of shared trust, quiet support, and unspoken connection crystallized into something undeniable. They stood together in the garden, the sun warming their faces as the scent of roses filled the air. For the first time, Martha allowed herself to believe in a future she hadn't dared to imagine. A future where she wasn't just a part of James's world, but at its center. The morning stretched on, and as they walked back to the house side by side, Martha felt a quiet joy settle within her. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew, with James beside her, it would be filled with possibility. Together, they were ready to embrace the new beginning that lay before them. The following weeks brought a sense of renewal to the Bennett estate. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, there were no sudden changes or grand gestures, but a gradual shift that breathed new life into the house and its inhabitants. Martha noticed it in the way James spent more time lingering in the kitchen, talking to her about his day, or how he would join her in the garden, often with a book in hand, content to simply share the space. One sunny afternoon, Martha stood in the library, carefully dusting the shelves. She paused over an old leather-bound volume that had once belonged to James's father, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, her fingers brushing over the handwritten dedication on the first page. It spoke of wisdom, courage, and the strength to embrace change, qualities Martha felt resonated deeply with her now. As she turned the page, James entered the room, his presence filling the space effortlessly. "Lost in thought again?" he teased lightly, leaning against the doorframe. Martha smiled, holding up the book. "Your father's words still feel as relevant as ever." James stepped closer, taking the book from her hands and glancing at the inscription. "He was a wise man," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I wish I'd appreciated that more when he was here." "You've carried his wisdom with you," Martha said softly. "Even if you didn't realize it." James looked at her, his expression warm. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Not always, but I try." He closed the book gently and placed it back on the shelf. "Martha, I've been thinking about the house, about us, about the future." Her heart skipped at the mention of us, though she kept her expression neutral. "What about it? I've spent so long focusing on maintaining what was built before me," he said, gesturing to the library around them. "But I've realized it's time to start creating something of my own, something that reflects the life I want now." Martha tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her chest. "And what does that life look like?" James hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "It looks like a house filled with laughter and warmth. A place where people feel at home, not just because of its size or grandeur, but because of the love within it. And it's not something I can build alone." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her like a gentle embrace. "James, are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd consider staying," he interrupted gently, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not as my housekeeper, but as my partner." In every sense of the word. Martha stared at him, her heart pounding. She had never imagined such a moment, never allowed herself to dream of it, yet here it was, offered to her with sincerity and warmth. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Say yes," James replied softly. "Say we can take this one step at a time. Say we can build something together." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she smiled through them, her hand reaching for his. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion. "I'll stay. I'll build with you." James's smile widened, and he squeezed her hand gently. Then it settled. They stood together in the quiet of the library, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting a golden glow around them. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic gesture, but it was theirs, a quiet moment of connection, a bridge to the life they would build together. In the days that followed, the changes became more tangible. James began reorganizing parts of the house, opening up spaces for new possibilities. He encouraged Martha to take time for herself, to explore interests and hobbies she had long set aside. Slowly, the estate began to feel less like a monument to the past and more like a living, breathing home. And through it all, their bond deepened. They found joy in the smallest moments, sharing breakfast on the terrace, walking through the gardens at dusk, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. The house that had once been a place of duty and routine now echoed with laughter, warmth, and the quiet promise of a shared future. As Martha stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James joined her, a cup of tea in hand. He handed it to her with a smile, his own gaze fixed on the glowing sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," he agreed, though his eyes remained on her, "and it feels like the beginning of something extraordinary." She turned to him, her smile mirroring his. "It does." In that moment, surrounded by the gentle embrace of twilight, Martha felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The past, with all its struggles and secrets, had led her here. And for the first time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days turned to weeks, and the Bennett estate seemed to glow with a new vibrancy. The grand halls, once stoic and formal, now echoed with laughter and quiet moments of connection. Martha found herself waking each morning with a sense of purpose that felt entirely new, not tied to duty, but to joy. One crisp autumn morning, Martha stood by the kitchen window, gazing out at the garden bathed in golden light. A steaming cup of tea warmed her hands as she watched James crouch near the flower beds, discussing something animatedly with Clara, the young server they had met at the Prescott wedding. Martha smiled at the sight, marveling at how easily James had welcomed new faces into the estate, a testament to the changes they were both embracing. James entered the kitchen a few moments later, brushing dirt from his hands. "Clara's got a good eye for design," he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "She suggested we add a stone path through the roses. What do you think?" Martha turned to him, her smile soft. "I think it's a wonderful idea. The garden deserves someone with her passion." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "I wouldn't have thought to bring her on if it weren't for you, you know." "Me?" Martha asked, surprised. James stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "You've shown me what it means to trust people, to let them in. This place feels alive again because of you." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked down at her tea. "You've done more than you realize, James." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but grounding. "We've done it together." The simplicity of his words resonated deeply with her. For years, she had worked quietly in the background, never imagining herself as part of something greater. Now, she saw herself not just as a caretaker, but as a partner, a presence that mattered deeply in the life they were building. That evening, they hosted a small gathering in the garden, a first for the estate in many years. The guests included a mix of old friends and new faces, people who had become part of their evolving story. The stone path through the roses was partially complete, its unfinished edges a fitting symbol of the growth still to come. Martha moved through the gathering with ease, her presence as natural as the autumn breeze. She spoke with Eleanor, who offered her characteristic wit and wisdom, and with Clara, whose excitement about the garden plans was infectious. But it was James's quiet glances, his steady presence, that anchored her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of amber and rose, James raised a glass to the small group. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice warm. "This house has always stood as a symbol of the past, but tonight it feels like a celebration of what's ahead." His eyes found Martha's, and his smile deepened. "And it wouldn't have been possible without Martha. She's been the heart of this home, the one who's shown me how to see its potential, not just in the house, but in myself." The group raised their glasses in a toast, their voices blending in a chorus of agreement. Martha's cheeks flushed, but her heart swelled with pride and gratitude. She met James's gaze, her own smile mirroring his. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Martha found herself standing by the roses, the cool night air brushing against her skin. James joined her moments later, his steps quiet but deliberate. "You disappeared," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "Just needed a moment," she replied, her gaze on the path winding through the garden. "It's all so beautiful." James stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "It is, but it's only the beginning." She turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "The beginning of what?" He smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. "Of the life we've been building together." Martha felt her breath catch, the simplicity of his words carrying a depth that left her momentarily speechless. She looked at him, at the man who had once been her distant employer and was now so much more. In his eyes, she saw not just admiration but a love that had grown quietly over the years, rooted in respect and trust. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "Not for myself." James reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You deserve it, Martha, every bit of it." They stood together beneath the stars, the garden around them alive with the sounds of the night. The path before them was still unfinished, but it no longer felt daunting. It felt like an opportunity, a journey they would take, step by step, side by side. For the first time, Martha felt a peace that came not from retreating into the background, but from standing fully in her own light. She belonged here, not just in this house, but in the life she and James were creating. As they walked back toward the house, their hands still intertwined, Martha knew that the future would hold challenges and joys, uncertainties and triumphs. But she also knew, with unwavering clarity, that she wouldn't face it alone. Together, they had built something extraordinary, a life rooted in love, trust, and the quiet strength that had brought them here. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.